Hello, my name is Laura Wall, and I chose to research for my oral video project effects of poverty on bonding and attachment in infancy. I was assigned infancy as my developmental stage. Just for some background, infant psychosocial development. Infants from 0 to 3 months, infants are open to stimulation. They begin to show interest and curiosity, and they smile readily at people. From 3 to 6 months, infants can anticipate what's about to happen and experience disappointment when that doesn't happen. They show this by becoming angry or acting warily. They smile, coo, and laugh often, and this is a time of social awakening and early reciprocal exchanges between the baby and the caregiver, which we'll come to learn is really important. From 6 to 9 months, infants play social games, like peekaboo and looking for a caregiver, and they'll try to get responses from people. They talk to, touch, and cajole other babies to try to get them to respond, and they express more differentiated emotions. They'll show joy and fear and anger and surprise on a little bit more complex level than they were before. From 9 to 12 months, infants are intensely preoccupied with their principal caregiver. They may become afraid of strangers and act subdued in new situations. So this is when you'll see, if someone hands a baby off to someone that they don't know and they're kind of in that 9 to 12 month range, the baby is not happy and they're reaching for their primary caregiver. By 1 year, they communicate emotions more clearly. They're showing moods and ambivalence and gradations of feelings. And then from 12 to 18 months, infants and toddlers too explore their environment using the people they are most attached to as a secure base, which we'll come to learn is really important. And as they master the environment, they become more confident and more eager to assert themselves and explore, in a further proximity away from their secure base or their safe haven. Attachment, according to Papala, Odds, and Feldman, is a reciprocal, enduring emotional tie between an infant and a caregiver, each of whom contributes to the quality of the relationship. So there's 4 different kinds of attachment. There's secure attachment, which is when the infant cries when the caregiver leaves and actively seeks the caregiver on their return. So this is what we see kind of in that 9 to 12 month range. They're very confused and upset when their caregiver leaves, but they actively accept their caregiver when they come back. Avoided attachment is when the infant rarely cries when they're separated from the caretaker, and they completely avoid their caretaker when their caretaker returns. So that's very similar to the name, avoidant attachment. They're avoiding their caretaker. Ambivalent attachment is when the infant becomes anxious and they can tell that a caretaker is about to leave. They become extremely upset when the caretaker actually does leave, but they do a combination of the two. They both seek their caretaker when they return, and they also resist or ignore their caretaker when they return. And then disorganized attachment is when, after separation, the infant shows kind of contradictory behaviors upon return. All right, Bowlby and Ainsworth. They are 2 key developers in the attachment theories. John Bowlby was the pioneer in the study of bonding in animals. In his research with animals, he also spent some time observing at a pediatric psychoanalytic clinic in London, and he was kind of the first person to really identify the importance of mother-baby bonding. And then Mary Ainsworth was a student of Bowlby's, so she kind of followed in his footsteps and studied attachment and designed an assessment tool for attachment known as the strange situation. And this is something that is still used frequently to evaluate attachment. And essentially what happens is first the parent and child will walk into an empty room with toys set up in it, and the child will begin to will get down off the parent's lap and will begin to explore in the room, within their comfort to leave their caretaker. And then a stranger, or the person who's doing the evaluating, will enter the room. and the parent will quietly leave the room while, the child is distracted with a toy or something. And, likely the child will notice and will respond in one of a few ways, and the parent will then come back into the room and comfort the child. And based on, how the child acts in those various stages, Mary Ainsworth was able to categorize that as, a different attachment style to be able to evaluate it. So again, that is called the strange situation. All right. Ziana, Berlin, and Boris in 2011 were able to kind of create a model for what development of attachment looks like from birth to 18 months. So from 0 to 2 months, the infant has limited ability to discriminate among different caregivers. The infant is able to recognize the mother's smell and sound, but there's really no preference between the mother or any other caregiver. From 2 to 3 months, the emergence of social interaction begins. So you'll begin to see, when someone walks in the room, the baby will look at them and maybe smile. There's increased eye-to-eye contact. So instead of just, glances that they were doing in those first couple months, it's more of an intense eye contact with social smiling and responsive cueing. From 3 to 7 months, the infants are able to discriminate among different caregivers. They still don't have a really strong preference that they're expressing, but they are able to discriminate. They're comfortable with many familiar and unfamiliar adults, and they're, very eager and intensely motivated to engage other people. So they're, definitely seeking attention at this point. From 7 to 9 months is the emergence of selective attachment, as evidenced by the onset of stranger wariness and separation protest, which is, the distress and anticipation of separation from attachment figures. So, that's when they're beginning to sense, like we talked about in the attachment styles, that's when they're beginning to sense whether, someone's about to leave, and already be able to tell that that's coming and already be reacting on those things. So that starts around 7 to 9 months. And then from 9 to 18 months is the hierarchy of attachment figures becomes very evident. So it's very clear who the baby is most attached to and who might be secondary, and kind of going on from there. The infant is able to balance their need to explore and also their need to seek proximity. So, they're willing to, get down and explore and maybe move slightly out of vision, but they also want to stay within, a comfort level for them as far as proximity to their caretaker. This becomes even more evident with independent ambulation, which happens around 12 months. So that's, when they start to walk, it becomes a little bit more, clear that they're willing to explore and that they want to meet that need to explore, but that they also want to, continue to seek that proximity with their caregiver. Secure base behaviors and safe haven behaviors are both evident. So, they just want to know where they're safe, their secure base, which is their caregiver, or their safe haven. Alright, so establishing attachment. Babies build a model of what they can expect from their caregiver based on the interactions that they have in their early development. This model absolutely can change if the caregiver's behavior is inconsistent, and we'll talk more about that. It's definitely possible to go from having a secure attachment to going to having an insecure, or vice versa. But a secure attachment means that there's trust, and a insecure attachment means that there is mistrust in the relationship. So Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. From birth to 1 year is trust versus mistrust, which we're going to talk more about in just a minute. From 1 year to 3 years old is autonomy versus shame and doubt. From 3 years to 6 years is initiative versus guilt. From 6 years to 12 years is industry versus inferiority. From 12 years to 18 years is identity versus role confusion. From 18 years to 30 years is intimacy versus isolation. and from 30 years to old age is generativity versus stagnation, and old age is integrity versus despair. So Erickson's trust versus mistrust. This is the first stage of Erickson's psychosocial development. In this stage is when infants develop a sense of reliability of people and objects. It begins in infancy and it continues until approximately 18 months. Trust is what lets them form those intimate relationships, and mistrust enables them to protect themselves and kind of put a wall up. If an infant is able to establish trust, it lets them achieve the virtue of hope, which is belief that they'll be able to fulfill their needs and obtain their desires in future endeavors. And that is, the goal for every infant, to feel the trust and to be able to establish a secure attachment, in order to be able to have that virtue of hope, where they will know that they'll be able to fulfill their needs and obtain their desires in future. When mistrust outweighs trust, an infant will view the world as unpredictable or unfriendly, which is really sad. So some research. DiCarlo and Onwujuba and Baumgartner wrote that infants' cortisol levels were found to be impacted by the quality and appropriateness of maternal interactions with and responsiveness to infants' cues. The cortisol levels over time affect the brain structure and cognitive functions. I found this really interesting because I think it just shows how important the maternal interactions and the trusting, secure relationship building at this pivotal age when they're establishing all these things, and the fact that there's even being shown that there's physical repercussions of having these things or not having these things. I think it's really, really interesting. They also explain that the perception of the caregiver as a secure piece was dependent on the quality of the infant's attachment. So it's kind of a relationship that really works both ways. While the infant's attachment is based off of the caregiver's responsiveness and all of those things, the quality of the infant's attachment is really dependent on how they perceive their caregiver. Freud has several stages of psychosocial development. The first stage is the oral stage, which is the pleasure centers on activities of the mouth, including feeding, sucking, chewing, and biting. The child really focuses on the stage at receiving and taking. Satisfying the need or seeking pleasure from each stage is required. Otherwise, the person will become fixated. So they'll be stuck kind of in that stage if they're not able to satisfy that need. If they become fixated, they're going to start to create what's called defense mechanisms, which are kind of just unconscious attempts to hide, suppress, or otherwise control the conflict. So they're not, the instinctive, it's not that you've satisfied the need, it's that you've now created this alternative way of satisfying the need by using a defense mechanism, whether that's, denial or repression or withdrawal or sublimation. And I think this really ties in interestingly to the topic that I'm covering, because I'm including poverty and how that affects attachment. And with poverty includes, feeding, sucking, chewing, and biting is how they're, consuming their food. And typically when our infants are in poverty, that is a need that's not being met. They're not getting the appropriate food that they should be. Typically they're hungry. And so that makes me wonder, what type of long-term effects that has on these kids when they're not meeting this stage. And they're creating these defense mechanisms, and how that trust of their caregiver to meet their needs is not being met, and how that affects attachment in the long term. So poverty. In 2014, these are some statistics according to the FeedingAmerica.org campaign. In 2014, 46.7 million people in the United States were in poverty. and that includes 15.5 million children, which I found really baffling.